are cubic equations, and the graphs are called cubic graphs. And what are cubic equations? So equations in which the power of x or y will be 3. For example, consider y is equal to 2x cube. So this is a cubic equation. And how does a cubic graph look like? So the graph will look like this. So just remember, if the coefficient of x cube is positive, so for example 2 in this case, then the graph starts from the bottom left and it will go towards the top right. If you observe carefully here, if we start from minus infinity, x is minus infinity and we are going towards positive infinity. So if x is negative infinity, y is also negative infinity. If we put x as 0, the value of y will be 0, and if x is positive infinity, then y also is positive infinity. So just remember the shortcut. If the coefficient of x cube is positive, then the graph goes from bottom to the top. But it needs to cross the origin since we do not have any constant in front of 2x cube. So it is 2x cube. Y is equal to 2x cube can also be written as 2x cube plus 0. And because of that 0, this graph is passing through the origin. Now, let us consider a variation of this equation. So y is equal to 2x cube plus 5. Now, since we are adding the number 5, so the entire graph will be shifted up by 5 units. And let's see how will the graph look like. So it will be a cubic graph. So the shape of the graph will stay as it is, but the entire graph will be shifted up by 5 units. So if you observe carefully, starting from the origin up till this point, so this particular length will be 5 units. Now we consider another type of these equations where the coefficient of x cube will be negative. So for example, y is equal to minus 3x cube. In this case, the shape of the graph is quite similar, but it is inverted, upside down. So what do I mean? So the shape of the graph looks like this. So in the previous case, the graph started from bottom and it went towards the top. Here, we will start from the top and will go towards the bottom. So the value of y starts at positive infinity and crosses 0 and then goes towards negative infinity. So all we need to do is just focus on what is in front of x cube. If it is positive, then the graph starts from the bottom. If the coefficient of x cube is negative, then the graph starts from the top, crosses the origin and goes towards the bottom. Now let us consider another variation of this equation. Example, y is equal to minus 3x cube minus 4. So in the previous case, when we had a plus 5, so the entire graph was shifted up by 5 units. So in this case, where we have minus 3x cube minus 4, so the shape of the graph will be as it is, as minus 3x cube, but the entire graph will be shifted down by 4 units. So how will the graph look like? Shape of the graph will stay as it is, but it has been pushed down by 4 units. So this particular length from the origin to this point, this particular length will be 4 units. And now let us have a quick summary of what we have learned so far regarding equations and graphs. So if the equations are y is equal to mx plus c or mx minus c, these are linear equations and the graph are straight lines. If you recall, y is equal to mx is a straight line which is passing through the origin. But if we have mx plus c, we are adding something, then the entire graph shifts up by c units. On the other hand, y is equal to mx minus c, the graph shifts down by c units. Similarly, in the quadratic equations of this form, if you are adding something, so ax square plus c, in this case, the graph shifts up by c units, and ax square minus c, the graph shifts down by c units. Same thing we do with the cubic equations. If we are adding something, the graph will shift up, and if we are subtracting something, the graph shifts down. Now, please observe something very carefully. All of these equations start with y is equal to something. So here y is equal to mx, y is equal to ax square, y is equal to ax cube. So on the left hand side, we only have y. And in such cases, if you are adding a number, the graph will shift up by c units. And if you are subtracting any number, the graph will shift down by that many units. So c units in this case. But now let us focus on the other type of equations, other type of quadratic equations. So this is a quadratic equation, but it is quadratic in y because the power of y is 2. In this case, the transition of the graph will work a little differently. So consider y square is equal to 2x. We already know the shape will be a parabola. But if we are adding some number plus c, then the entire graph will be shifted towards the left hand side. And if equation is of the form y is equal to 2x minus c, the entire graph will be shifted towards the right. But please notice the difference. On the left hand side, when we were adding or subtracting, the graph was being shifted up or down by the same units. For example, in mx plus c, the graph was shifting by c units, mx minus c, the graph is shifting again by c units. But in this case, when we are starting with y square is equal to something here, shifting of the graph will not happen at the same magnitude as that constant. So in this case, the graph is definitely shifting towards the left, but it will not shift by c units. By how many units does it shift? We can find out using basic algebra, but for physics, it's not required. We just need the general shape while solving the physics questions. Now, let us consider cubic equations. Y cube is equal to 2x plus c or 2x minus c. So even in this case, if we are adding something plus c, then the graph will shift to the left. And if we are subtracting something minus c, then the graph will shift to the right. But please note, this kind of shifting will only happen if the coefficient of x is positive. So here we saw 2x, positive 2x. Here also the coefficient of x is positive. But if the coefficient of x becomes negative, for example, y square is equal to negative 2x plus c or negative 2x minus c. So in such cases where the coefficient of x is negative, then the shifting of the graph will be opposite to what we have done so far. Let me explain. In this case, we are adding something, so the graph will be shifted to the right hand side. And if we are subtracting something, the graph will be shifted towards the left hand side. Similarly, let us consider y cube is equal to minus 2x plus minus c. So this is also of the same type where the coefficient of x is negative. In such cases, if we are adding something, the graph will be shifted to the right. And if you are subtracting something, the graph will be shifted towards the left. But did you notice a fundamental difference between the left side and the right hand side? That difference is if the equation is of the form y is equal to something, in those cases, either we add something or subtract something, the graph will be shifted by the same number of units. So in the equation where we had a c, so the graph will be shifted up and down by the same units. So c units. Here also you can see that the magnitude of the shift up and down is the same, c units. So how much shifting is done depends on the number in the equation. But if the equations are of this form, what is this form? So on the right hand side of the equation, we have a x. It could be either positive x or negative x. So the equations are y square is equal to something or y cube is equal to something. Here notice the shifting does happen, but the amount of shift is not the same as the number involved. So here I have mentioned the graph is shifting left, but the graph is not shifting by c units. By how much the graph has been shifted left or right, that we can easily find using some basic algebra. But that is not required for physics. This was the entire summary of linear and quadratic and cubic equations. Now we come to the next type of equations, which are circles and ellipses.